Okay, it's Monday morning. Bring it in, troops. Little show from home. How's everybody doing? Hope you had a good weekend.
We're good.
Thorpe is there, and Double H. Do you prefer to be called Double H?
It's 50-50. You know what? I can tell who and how I know who someone is and how I know them by what they call me.
Right.
So you're Erica Vanstone, Executive Director of the Women's Flat Track Derby Association. You're joining us from Philadelphia?
I am.
And we were introduced by Jane McManus, who's like a great human being.
Amazing person.
And we asked you to come on the show to talk about reopening and science and all that kind of stuff, which we do want to totally get to. But first, we need to learn a lot about flat track derby because it seems so badass. We watched a little video. Actually, Judy, can you show us a little video? Is it possible we could see a little bit of those highlights you had going?
Oh, I need a second then. Give me a minute.
Okay, yeah. We can just vamp. It's fine. Wait.
Yeah, roller derby is the best. Do you want me to tell you
Jane McManus stories really fast?
Oh, yeah.
About Dunkin' Donuts? What's
well, I can tell you that I personally am a donut connoisseur. And one of the reasons why is because I've traveled a lot of the United States in particular over the last 10 years as part of roller derby. And I'm a vegetarian, so sometimes the food you can get is sketchy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, here we go. This is great. But you can always find a great bakery that has a decent donut in any town in America. So thus began my donut loving story. But yeah, this is roller derby. And this is from our 2019 championships event in Montreal, Canada. And, where do you want me to start?
I reminded a little bit of there was a moment I was in this NBA referees meeting and they showed a bunch of really, really rough play. And they gave the mic to Kevin McHale, a retired player, just to be like, okay, what fouls do you see, right? They're trying to prove how hard it is to referee. And he was like, I don't see any fouls. This reminds me of that. It's I don't even know where to begin. What are you not allowed to do? You can just kind of throw people around and stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to make sure I answer Randy's question. It is cake donuts all the way, 100%, unless it's a fritter, which is yeasted, and then that's my answer. But back to roller derby, the flat track version, first of all, you hear the words roller derby, you probably think about bank track, which is something that was pretty predominant in the 70s and into the 80s, 60s. And there were these massive tracks, and bank track still exists. But those tracks are $30,000, $50,000 to acquire, and then you have to break them down, move them around. You have to have a space that'll accommodate it. So it became pretty expensive to have a bank track. And some skaters in Austin, Texas kind of sat down and figured out that if you got a piece of chalk and a parking lot, you could draw a track. And essentially that's how flat track started. And it kind of started with many of the same rules and regulations that you saw in bank track, very fast-paced, lots of hits. The basics are still very much the same, which is that each team has what's called a jammer. And the jammer has the star in their helmet, and they are, to use sort of football analogies, they are the ball, the quarterback, and the running back kind of at the same time. But your goal is to try to pass as many opponents as you can within a given amount of gameplay. And in the same way that football has downs, roller derby has jams. And they can be up to 2 minutes in increments. So essentially, your job as the jammer is to try to score points by passing opponents. And that sounds easy until you realize that your blockers are trying to both block your opposing jammer and try to help you get through at the same time. So there's up to 10 humans on the track at any given moment, 4 blockers for your team, 1 jammer for your team. And everybody's on skates.
And by the time you're having a beer afterward, is everybody bloody, or are you not?
You know what? Most of the time you're not bloody, but they're bruised up for sure.
Yeah.
And often within the days following a game or a scrimmage is really when you realize where you got hit. You won't realize sometimes where you fell or got hit until several days later.
What's a typical score?
It's a pretty high scoring game. So you'll see points in the hundreds.
Yeah.
And we changed the rules last year. There was what was called a jammer lap point, where you could also score a point against the opposing jammer after you had successfully lapped the pack. But we decided to take that away. And so now it is strictly scoring on blockers.
Are there coaches?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Many.
I asked because David's a coach, and I occasionally propose we could play basketball without coaches. For instance, in a coronavirus pandemic, when the coaches are 70 plus, and it might be risky, and I'm just trying to needle him. That's all. That's all that's happened. That's why I asked.
He's trying to make sure I don't have that career anymore.
Yeah, sorry about your job.
When you say many coaches, like offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, head coach,
yeah. So
coaches.
The beauty of roller derby is that you are playing offense and defense at the same time,
Right.
often within the same formation. Formations are often designed to both allow if you've got 4 blockers, maybe 3 of them are playing defense, 1 of them is playing offense. Those formations can change depending on the dynamics of the play within any given moment. So what you typically have on a bench is what's called an A or an alternate, which is the human who is responsible for calling reviews or challenges, as they might be in other sports, which you can do. We don't have booth review, though, which makes it a little challenging. Like, you have to basically remember everything that happened and then sit down and describe it to the officials as you saw it. Then
Does that ever work?
It does. It does. It absolutely does.
Wow.
Yeah, mines are pretty sharp. Then you would typically have what we would also call like a base coach in baseball. You can sit at one of the turns and echo. There's usually one person on the bench whose job it is to communicate with the jammers for call-offs. So if a jammer gets through, the first jammer to get through the pack after the whistle cleanly becomes what we call lead jammer. And the jam increments can be 2 minutes, but you can strategically call off the jam if you are lead jammer to prevent your opponent from scoring points. So you'll have a coach there often telling you, keep going, run it long, or, hit it and quit it and get out of there. And then sometimes
based on how fast you think the other team's jammer is?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly correct. Or like where they are, maybe they were in the penalty box, coming back from the penalty box, and now they're about to score again. So you got to have a lot of eyes on the track. And you can have up to 4 coaches at the bench.
Wow. I like this. I'm intrigued with the penalty box idea, because based on what I saw, everything was legal.
Yeah, so we definitely have target blocking zones and like parts of your body that you are allowed to block with. And we've tried to de-emphasize contact to the head because we, in women's sports, we don't have a lot of good data or research projects around contact on our bodies. So we have had, which by the way, we are engaged in. We do have data research projects before the pandemic that we were conducting that we're going to resume after the pandemic, because we just don't have a lot of good data on women's contact sports. So we are creating rule sets to the best of our ability that kind of help us manage those injuries as much as you can for a sport that relies on hitting other people on roller skates.
I'll tell you one thing I've noticed. I've never seen it, and I'd love to. And suddenly it occurred to me this morning watching this. I'm like, oh, my daughter's gonna do this. She's important for this. Like, she's gonna love this. I just mentioned it to her, and she was like, oh yeah, probably. But I have noticed that people start it and then love it so much that it reorient their lives around it because it's so thrilling, right? Like it's.
Yeah, Jane was one of those people.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people for sure. And I think folks always ask that question, like, what is it about roller derby that's so special? And I think women just, first of all, we are a sport that's really working on opening up the possibilities for women identifying athletes, for trans athletes, for gender expansive athletes. So the opportunities that are out there in the sports world for folks in our community aren't very large. We're not really, like, there aren't many competitive pathways for us. Further, there are quite a few of us who never really, like myself, I played JV soccer growing up, and that was the extent of my high school athletics career. So the idea that just about anybody at any age could put on roller skates and compete in this sport that requires a heavy amount of contact, it challenges you in a way that I think a lot of people in our community have never had the opportunity to be challenged in before. So I think that is a big part of the appeal.
And there's something, I mean, maybe everybody doesn't experience it, but for me personally, right? Like, there's a giant thrill in just like using your body in that way, right? Like, things happen with endorphins and hormones ever, like after a couple hours, you're like, what? Like, it's that kind of fun that you don't have like watching a movie or whatever, right? It just is.
Yeah, it is. And it's so funny because I think I'm a blocker, and like, as I was learning and growing, I think, the pinnacle of what a blocker was doing maybe even 5 years ago was hitting. And now we're kind of refining the sport to the point where containment is actually the preferable goal. So I'm trying to think of an analogy. It's like, we're not looking to tackle, we're looking to contain. And so we're basically, instead of using our bodies to hit, we're trying to use techniques and strategies to keep the jammers where we want them. So it's
like boxing out in basketball.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just blocking out. That's what you just described was basically how we try to play NBA defense. Is you're trying to corral ball handlers into certain segments of the court where you've got things like the sideline and the baseline to help you.
Yep.
Or send them into your best defender, which in our league is 7 feet tall guys.
Yep.
That's typically what we're doing. Yeah.
So how do you come to run a league? How does that happen?
Well, you mean like a club or?
No, I mean, how did you get your job?
WFTDA.
Yeah, what was your path?
Wow. Okay.
Take a while.
No, that's okay. So I went to film school.
Perfect.
In New York. Again, nothing sports related.
Yeah.
And
wait, where did you go to film school?
I went to NYU.
Me too.
What?
Yeah.
You went to did you go to film school?
No, I studied journalism in CAS.
Oh, yeah.
Your school was much harder to get into than the one that I applied to, for sure.
Yeah. What was interesting is that it kind of prepared me for being in a very male-dominated space like sports.
We're here for you.
Because the film industry is, and was then in the 90s when I went to school, and still is
When did you graduate, if you don't mind my asking?
From NYU?
Yeah.
97.
I graduated in 95.
All right. We were there at the same time. We'll have to talk about dorms later. So, and the film industry is just, it is this and has been this very male dominated space. And so I moved to Philly after I went to school in New York because it was so expensive. I just couldn't justify working as a production assistant and trying to live in Manhattan. And so I was like, oh, I'll just move to Philly because it seems to be affordable. It's not that far away. I had friends who were there. And then I worked in and around the film industry in Philly for a while, doing films and commercials and television. And I had been a documentary filmmaker, and I walked into my first roller derby event and I was like, I want to know what's going on here, and I want to be able to share with other people what's going on here. So the first parts of my introduction to roller derby were as an announcer, and then also to work on the broadcast program. So in 2012, the Women's Flat Track Derby Association let me start a broadcast program. And so the stuff that you were just showing is kind of the evolution of that program, because I realized the only way that folks are really going to understand roller derby are through the broadcast, the production values, the layout, the way, the design, the production design of the sport. So we worked with a bunch of vendors and over time created this look. And so the executive director in 2015 ended up leaving of the WFTDA and had a replacement who promoted me to chief media officer and then left. And then I became the interim and then was hired on permanently in 2018 as the executive director.
So did you have a different full-time job? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, when did you become
Yes.
full-time?
So what's interesting is that I think roller derby as an amateur sport is also a volunteer sport at many levels, especially on the ground. Any given league in your area or club in your area will be run by volunteers. So I ran the broadcast program as a volunteer for several years until they hired me as a staff member in 2014, I think.
Okay. So then coronavirus comes and you have a giant number of volunteers out there who want to play the sport, and you have all the same decisions that Adam Silver has to make in the NBA. Basically, when do you shut it down? How did you go about that thinking?
You know, roller derby, because we are, in particular in the WFTDA, because we are a volunteer-driven sport, we're a nonprofit, we're an international governing body. Like you said, we don't have the same resources that pro sports have, but we have the community, which is actually a pretty powerful source of energy and momentum. So essentially what we did is where the org is based in Austin, Texas, but the staff is kind of all over the world. And so I, living in Philly, and one of my colleagues who is the senior director of international affairs, she lives right outside of New York City in Westchester. And we both experienced kind of some of the worst that this virus has to offer. So I think a lot of the decisions made out of the COVID-19 shutdowns, return to play plans came from our two experiences on the ground in cities that were just absolutely devastated by COVID-19. So I think you'll find that a lot of our plan is informed by that.
And what's your connection and affinity for data? That is not something we see often in sports. And you studied, I'm sure in film numbers come up, but you didn't minor in any kind of data science, did you?
No, but what's interesting is that when I started the broadcast program, we began to use a pay-per-view monetization platform, and the downloads that we were able to get from some of those customer insights, I thought, I looked at them and I was like, I have questions. I want to know more about who these humans are, what they're doing, where they're from. And so I think a lot of people who get involved in data or who are interested in data-based decisions are people who have questions and kind of come to the place where they realize that you don't have to operate in the dark. You can find out the answers to those questions. So that really started me on the path of asking those questions and surveys and engagements and sort of focused conversations within the sport.
Well, we know you have a personality quality where when we first joined you today, you were like feeling very pleased that you had just updated a table in Tableau, right? I know what you're talking about. Judy really knows what you're talking about, right, Judy? Okay. And so then how did this, now you have, the reason that we really want to talk to you is because, Jane's been amazing in talking about the coronavirus and applying science and using data about being safe, and everything she tweets, I seem to think is like, why is everybody Jane McManus on this issue? She's so right on it. And so I asked her for a story I was writing, who's doing a good job of this? And immediately she responded within a minute with your name and this plan. And then eventually it was completed and you've shared a copy of it, and it's it's like a dream of what I wish every league had.
It's like from the future.
I'm
watching like a Star Trek episode.
I am a big Star Trek fan.
Compared to the Flintstones.
How did you do this? How were you able to solve the riddle of using data to reopen safely? Like, what was the process?
Well, so it's not easy. I'm going to say that. It was not easy, and it continues to be not easy because we operate WFTDA roller derby in over 23 countries. And I say over 23 countries because some folks live in one country and participate in another. But and we're talking about roughly 40,000 humans, including support staff, officials. So in the United States, we can't even get consistent baseline data from the federal government. Now,
Wait, they're not doing a perfect job? I'm sorry.
Now we move towards state level governance. And then for those of us who live in larger cities, city level governance. So between the three of those, there are not consistencies. There are not consistencies in the way that information is shared. And certainly consistencies in information about the virus changes from day to day. So I think we realized pretty quickly that we were on our own. So we did the best that we could. And again, David, as a data person, the only thing we could do is try to figure out how to answer the questions that we had. And the questions that we had, we started with the basic question of what does a safe environment potentially look like given the data that anybody has access to within our ranks? What are the very baseline conditions we would want to see before anybody steps foot on a track? And then what are the indicators that something might be going on in that community that would cause sports to want to take a break again, right? Because we've heard a lot about how the virus might potentially go in waves and how folks might open their sports back up again and have to shut down. We wanted to design a system that gave us baseline conditions and then give us a pathway to follow for what to do if things start to get scary again.
Can we maybe look at the doc now a little bit, if you don't mind?
And can you compare, while we're putting this up, Erica, you're in a unique position of dealing with multiple governments globally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about that, what you're seeing here compared to maybe Germany, wherever? I know that you're in a lot of places.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to really give some thanks to our community members who stepped up, because the second we realized that we were on our own, we reached out to our community and we said, hey, we know some of you are epidemiologists, frontline workers, scientists, medical doctors. If you have the time to spare, we would really appreciate it. And we found an amazing group of humans, including epidemiologists, medical doctor, emergency, a paramedic, is our risk management coordinator, our risk management committee chair. And we basically put a team together whose job it was to kind of come up with some of these parameters. So can we go to the baseline conditions real quick? Because I think this is the thing that really took us the longest. Like you're saying, because there are folks in different countries. Germany was doing a really good job right off the bat of trying to explain kind of what their baseline conditions would have to be in order for people to get back together. But they also, at times, were very date focused, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're going to open back up in August. And so if you could pause on this for a quick second.
This is date right here.
Yeah, so we really thought, and so this actually, we went back and forth on this for over a week and a half, which doesn't seem like long, but this was the last piece of the puzzle that we kind of put in here, because what is a safe amount of COVID in your community to participate? It is. And so like, we created this plan knowing that we might have to change that. right? Like we might create this as our baseline condition and get in there and find out that this is also just simply too much for the environment, right? Like our goal in this plan is to keep our athletes, our officials, our coaches, our announcers free from COVID-19. We are not contemplating a world in which, oh, maybe someone younger and healthier gets sick. That is not what we want. We don't know enough about this infection. We don't know enough about who could potentially be exposed to this because one league member or one club member gets it. So our goal with this is to try to save lives. The number that our epidemiologists kept coming back to is 5 in 10,000 for smaller communities or maybe more spread out communities, because we have communities, for example, in the Midwest or in the Southwest that don't necessarily have city data, they have county data because they're so spread out.
Right.
And then we also wanted to address the fact that folks living in major cities have a pretty hard road ahead. So we wanted to give them some thoughts around what it could look like. So basically 5 in 10,000 was for the smaller communities, and we created a table so folks could see some of those ideals. And then we gave them a math formula for the 50 in 100,000 that we were looking for. And you could see I used the city of Philadelphia's data because I kept asking this same question myself. And the important metric here is over the course of 14 days, right? So that's like a 2-week window where you have this amount of cases. And if you want to average it out so you know what to look for per day, for example, the city of Philadelphia reports daily COVID cases. So if I wanted to figure out how many cases per day we need to be at or under in order for us to start looking at a return, it's around 56 cases.
And where is it now? Do you know?
It is about like maybe a little over 120.
Okay.
So we still have some ways to go, and that's consistent with what the PA Department of Health has been talking about as their initial metric was 50 and 100,000 over 14 days as well. So this isn't totally something that we pulled out of the blue. We have seen this around the country that epidemiologists have been talking about. But the over 14-day period is the important thing, because we are going to see little spikes. Like you might see 56 cases one day and then 74 another and then 32 another. So we wanted to make sure that folks had sort of like a 14-day window to take a look at.
That's active, or that's just how many are added each day?
That is how many are added each day.
That's what I thought. Okay.
And because honestly, David, the scary thing is that we don't know how long people are contagious for, right? We don't really know.
Right.
Just fighting the urge to think that just everybody that isn't managing this well, it's because they have too many men involved. Doesn't like come on.
men and money, I would say. Men and money. It's what you've done, Erica, what your team has done. Henry and I talk about this 5 days a week on the show, and we've never seen anything like this before.
I know.
It's like the most beautiful Van Gogh painting I've ever seen.
Wow.
And I love Van Gogh. It's what I coach athletes. I have a son that's about to go to college to play sports. I'm worried. I don't see anything like this anywhere except for your amazing sport, which is now I'm a huge fan of, along with Judy.
Wait, so Erica, are there reasons that every sport wouldn't follow your plan? I mean, is your sport different in some way? Like, should pickup basketball or rec basketball be following a similar program in your view?
Yeah, so essentially we also open it up to anybody who wants it. And so, Judy, I'll make sure that you get it because I think the emails are going out weekly. But folks can go to wftda.com and download it and attempt to use it if they would like to. And then we could try to get, our goal is to try to ask folks to give us their email address so that we can report if we have to update the plan, if anything changes, and then give us feedback on it to help to tell us if it's working.
Can Can you give us a glimpse of just some of the arguments when you were building this? There's no way everyone just said, okay, great. What was that? What were those debates like? Where were they centered? Where was the push? Who was successful in lobbying and why?
And everybody in the room's a trained fighter, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that may make things easier, actually.
Yeah. So essentially, we actually didn't really necessarily fight, but I think that the toughest thing for us to come up with was the formula or the metrics, the baseline metrics. Initially, when we created this plan, we said 0 cases of COVID in your area. None. Done. And then we realized that that was going to be a challenge because it's possible that New York City will never have no COVID. It's possible that Philly will never have no COVID. So we needed to kind of understand what the epidemiology community was recommending. And that was actually, I can't call it a fight, but it was certainly it was a debate, and it was a really important one. And I think it was a good, important moment for us to consider.
And are you, I'm sorry, Henry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, are you worried? You just, Henry talked about being in Philadelphia and seeing the reopening in a sense. And we've all seen the pictures like in LA yesterday at the protests. We know being outside is a much safer place to be, masked or not. It's definitely better to be out there. But knowing that Philadelphia is already double what's an acceptable baseline, are you concerned that it's going to be a long time? Because now with all the protesting, which we're all for, but is there a concern that we're not going to be down to those levels for a long time?
Yeah, and I first want to echo what you were implying, which is that Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And we in roller derby, in the WFTDA, in Philly, we give a crap. So we understand members of our organization and beyond stepping into the streets and saying, this is enough, we're done, this, no more. So I think that folks who are out there, including myself, and I will say that I brought my 12-year-old son to, it made the national news, the neighborhood that I live in Philadelphia, and the neighborhood my son's father lived in. There was a case in which there was some protesting happening outside of one of the police districts, and a group of white folks showed up with bats. So I'm sure you did see that.
I didn't see this.
And so then in the next day or so, families in the community organized a protest. So I said, you know what, this is worth it. And I took my 12-year-old, who also plays roller derby, and one of his friends out with masks, with hand sanitizer. And we sat and took a knee, with folks out there in the streets protesting. And I think that it is important. And every one of us who has done that recognizes that this could potentially represent a pause in roller derby. But I think the difference for us is that we did put a hashtag into the COVID plan, which is lives before laces. And for roller derby, our perspective is that human decency and safety and welfare and protection is more important than the sport itself. And I think that that is sometimes what gets lost in sports where folks are paid exorbitant salaries to participate, and where franchises are making money hand over fist, off the backs of players. And well, I could go on about that, but I think
go right ahead.
Because
take your time. We're here all day.
I'm in the business of collecting best friends, and I really am going to apply formally to be your best friend very soon, because this is great stuff.
Yes, let's do it.
Yeah, go on, Erica, please.
And what's particularly troubling for me is entities like the NCAA that are a collegiate amateur sports system.
Amateur, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. So here they are profiting off the backs of these kids who they are basically stepping forward and saying, they're looking across the landscape and calculating out the collateral damage instead of contemplating ways that they could be saving lives. And that's what we're not willing to do.
I had a conversation with someone who would like to not be named, but knows a lot about this kind of stuff. And basically, like, there are these government tables of like the value of a human life, and for other purposes, not created in coronavirus times, but like
the federal government talks about it every day.
Yeah,
like it's completely normalized that over 100,000 Americans have died from this disease, and I think it's
with no end in sight. With no end in sight, by the way.
That's not lost on us as a sport, and we don't subscribe to that at all.
So to me, like there's so many critical parts of this, but like a critical part of your plan, which is not being discussed in the NBA, we don't really know their plan yet. They're being a little cagey about it, but is you shut it down. There are a bunch of different triggers to shut it down. In basketball land, that idea comes with, but all the money we lose, right? Like, okay, how much money is worth it to you? I don't understand. Anyway, I don't understand why the virus doesn't know if it's a basketball player making a lot of money or an amateur in the park, right? And so to me, it is weird that they've been prepping us already for the notion that there are going to be some positive tests and it won't stop play. And we had an expert on the show talk about there's never going to be one positive test, right? Like everybody who has one test will have been living in close proximity with several others.
I have some thoughts about that too.
I
think the thing that makes us do things a little bit differently in the WFTDA is that we are at once the league and the players union. We are basically a democratic organization where members step forward and ask for what's best for them. Members contribute to changing the sport to make it safer, changing conditions, eradicating discrimination. And so when you've got a group of athletes who are advocating for their own well-being, the policy looks so different. And what really strikes me in these conversations around COVID is that players have so much power here. The athletes and the unions could step forward and say, we don't think one case of COVID is worth it for our players. We don't think that one player who contracts this virus is okay, because we cannot guarantee, we're not willing to hedge bets over whether or not we think that this person is going to die. And I don't understand. I've watched this play out over a bunch of different leagues over the last few weeks, and I don't understand why those conversations aren't being had, or if they're being had, why we're not hearing about more of that. We hear about the money end of it. We hear about, what the MLB and the Players Association are talking about in terms of money, but that has nothing to do with saving lives, and I don't know why.
What did you learn in all of your conversations with epidemiologists and doctors, et cetera? Like, if you have a ton of tests, what options does that give you? How does that increase the safety profile?
It increases the safety profile in that we could potentially stop cases before they reach our community. So for example, if there's more testing, if there's more contact tracing, there's more likelihood that folks will know when they've come in contact with somebody and isolate themselves so that they do not become a contributor potentially of the virus. And so part of our plan also addresses that, if someone in your household has COVID-19, you gotta stay home. Every time you go to strap on those skates, there is a list of symptoms that you must check to see if you have any of them. And if you do, stay home. And we know that's going to represent a culture change to folks too, because in roller derby, it's an amateur sport. People play because they love it, and they do love it, and they want to play, and they play through injury. Right. And so this isn't a culture that we can allow to persist in the age of COVID-19. So those are all parts of safety nets, I think, in the system, things like contact tracing and test kits.
Yeah, right. You're telling your athletes, if you have a broken ankle or a broken wrist, tape it up, let's go.
Yeah, exactly. Play through the pain.
If you have the sniffles or you're asymptomatic, but you're positive, you have to stay home. It's so counterintuitive to what athletes tend to doing.
So I played a game 2 years ago, and I did not wear a face shield at the time, and now I do, and it was because of that. But I took a shoulder to the nose, and I was gushing blood everywhere. And the only thing I could think of was, I got to get back in this game. How do I get back in this game? And the EMT next to me is like, in about 60 seconds, I'm taking you to the hospital because you've lost too much blood. And I'm like, no, I'm fine.
That's what athletes do, professional or not. That's what they do because they love it, like you said.
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, and if you want to like punt this question, fine. But like, if the NBA's gonna put a few thousand people, have them fly to Florida, live at Disney in a fairly closed bubble, and not stop games pretty much no matter what happens, how crazy does that sound to you? If and with tons of testing, and obviously carefully thought out plan within that, but just with what we know there, does that strike you as good, not good?
It strikes me as not good because I think they haven't necessarily had those conversations around values, right? So I think they have the money and the resources to be able to do it, but is it the same competitive pathway? And in particular, the NBA has a reduced number of teams that are going to compete and participate. And I understand that, but one of the things that we realized right away is that we have a cups, Continental Cups, which is kind of like a tournament that folks walk away with, an award. And then we have a playoff system that people rank into, and a WFTDA championship that pick the top winners of the playoffs. And there are a couple teams that get a bye, the top 4 teams. So essentially what we realized is if we couldn't have an event that was equitable and pulled from all of the possible teams that could compete, like we've got teams around the world that could be ranked into the playoffs and then championships. If some of them had to sit out because of COVID-19, that's not the competitive pathway we want. And already our competitive pathway needed some restructuring, so this is a good opportunity to do it. But it doesn't feel genuine to me. It doesn't respect the work that the players have put in from all of the leagues, all of the franchises across the leagues. I understand that they are trying to finish the season and create opportunities for the fans, but it also puts people at risk. I just don't think that it is. Just cancel the season and start over again when it's safer. And I wish that was what they chose.
If you were a mom and your son,
I am.
Sorry, my hypothetical goes quite a long way after that. If your son was 20 and played for the Sacramento Kings and was calling you now saying like, "Hey, great news! I can get my multi-million-dollar salary back. I have to go live in this bubble in Disney." What would your reaction be?
Are you sure you want to do that? Are you ready to die? No, seriously, right? Like we make these bargains with ourselves. And I would do it all the time in Philadelphia too. I was like, oh man, I have to go to the drugstore. Do I really? And we, in my house, we talk about that all the time. We, got to go to Target. Do you really have to go to Target? Yeah. Are we ready to die for more SodaStream refills?
Yeah.
So those are tough questions and conversations. And I'm noticing some questions and thoughts in the chats. That was one of the things that I was actually really disappointed in, the plan that the MLB put forward, which was basically like, no, we really don't have to quarantine people for 14 days. And I think that those types of decisions also really communicate out the values of a sport when you're not clear about those things. I saw a lot of, that's the word I'm looking for. I saw folks, instead of making data-based decisions, trying to use lack of data to justify decisions.
Oh, yeah.
We see that a lot. We see that a lot.
That's like America's main hobby right now.
I know.
I have a question that's a little bit offbeat, but it's going to be relevant. You'll see the design of your plan as it appears on your website looks like it was done by someone as professional and talented as you could ever get. It's super easy to read. It's colorful. How many people did it? How long did it take to do it? And are they also working for other organizations or teams? Because we need people like that to get messages to us.
So you mean the graphic design?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, so we, the roller derby community has so many talented people across a bunch of different industries. And the designer for this plan is a former skater from Texas named Amy Blaze. And she is just, we
Is that her real name or is that her old derby name?
Yeah, no, her derby name is, Centerfold. But we knew that we wanted a ladder. So we started with that. We said, we want to see a color-coded ladder because it's going to correspond to the Tableau map that we've put together so that folks will be able to, and what we've asked folks to do in the WFTDA is to go into the back end of our membership portal and to report what tier status that's at. So we knew that we needed a color-coded system because our map is basically a color code of what status any given league is at any given time. And the map is something we wanted to put together for a couple of reasons. One, to help keep the community informed, because we think that transparent data is the best tool that we can empower our members with in the community to look around and make decisions. So if they say, I want to play this team in Florida, they'll go and they'll look on the map that's updated weekly and they'll say, well, that team hasn't gotten past this tier yet. Maybe we shouldn't play them. And it helps to keep our community is really good at holding us accountable for things. And so I think a map helps us to do that. So we knew that
Sounds like a
was
really nice way of saying a difficult thing.
it is, but it's worthwhile. And we knew that the color-coded map was kind of the end result of what we wanted to do as a tool. So we basically worked backwards, and Amy created sort of like the color-coded ladder. And then we knew we wanted pull-out tiers so that they were really clear. And then what do you do if there are return cases in your community? So we gave steps for stepping back down the ladder if you have to.
Right. Well, and when you publicly declare it in advance, as you have done, then it gives everybody a chance to earn trust in the system, right? I feel like anybody who has a question, right? Like any parent, any loved one, etc., who's concerned about their, wait, do you say player?
Yeah, athlete, player, skater.
Is worried about their skater, can then like watch and learn and look at the community and do the check their own math, right?
Yeah.
This is what worries me a little about. I don't know what the NBA will say, but I'm a little worried that they tend to resolve with a lot of like what they have been leaking already, which is trust us, we consulted with a lot of experts. But like the actual decision-making process is a black box, which I'm always like, I don't trust you.
Right, because there's no transparency in conversation. There's no, we sat down and talked about this. Then we talked about this.
Yeah.
Are you?
To me, the analogy is Dr. Fauci, right? Like,
right.
The president will stand there with experts and summarize his view of the findings, which is nothing like as convincing as,
oh my goodness,
here's someone who works with data their whole lives and has a reputation in this area, right? And having them expand on it, I just feel like the latter is so much more convincing than the former.
Are your epidemiologists providing you organic information for you, or are they also looking at other experts and models? And who are they? Because we're always, besides Jane and Dana Smith, we're always looking to find Dr. Ilardi is amazing.
Can we have them?
Yeah, right.
You also could just lease yourselves out to the NBA. That'd be great.
I know, right?
Who are you following or reading that's helping you just be informed?
Yeah, so our epidemiologists are players and like athletes and officials. And so we've got two epidemiologists who work in the Southwest and have worked for state medical systems. Have worked for state medical systems. And we've got an infection control nurse who has also worked on the front lines. We've got a paramedic who works on the front lines, a medical doctor, a friend of mine who's an anesthesiologist here in Philly just joined the group, and me, who knows nothing really about medicine, and Karen Kuhn, our senior director of international affairs. So it is really, and where we're getting our data from is we're sitting down with, we actually created a very ad hoc committee from across the world when this first started, to start a thread internally on all of the reports that they were getting. So we basically started with a bunch of information from around the world, and then kind of sifted through the pile and whittled it down to what seemed relevant. And yes, I'm sure.
Now?
What are we working on now?
No, sorry. What are your worries now? Like, what's your anxiety?
Yeah. So, my worries are that we just don't know what we don't know. Initially, when we put this out, it was probably like 90% positive feedback, and then 10%, well, what about this? So I think we want to make sure that folks are using it, that they feel like it is easy is maybe not the best way to put it, but that it's usable. That it's a useful tool and not just a piece of work.
Right.
So I think my primary concerns right now are getting people onboarded to the system, making sure they understand it, making sure it makes sense for them, and then making sure they're reporting on the data in the back end so that what we're seeing is as accurate as possible. And those are my short-term concerns. My long-term concerns are that folks will feel frustrated by the lack of clarity around this disease. You know, the same concerns that all of you have, right? Like, I think knowing that there could be a vaccine coming, knowing that that vaccine might not ever get here, not knowing how long of a period of immunity that confers. Those are sort of the concerns that we're grappling with, I think.
What's right now, as we're talking, the most advanced league is on what tier? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so we actually saw someone report that they are on tier 5, but we're going to go back and look at that because,
check.
Yeah, but we do have folks around the world that are ready to start tier 1. I was watching the news this morning, and New Zealand does not have any new COVID-19 cases. We have leagues in New Zealand, and we know that they're ready to go most likely. So I think that other sort of hidden value in our plan is that we're going to be able to tell pretty quickly over the next couple of months which governments and which states are doing the best work to protect their citizens. Because where we're going to see progression up the ladder, those are the places that we'll be able to take a look at those recommendations and figure out, yeah, New Zealand was really on top of it. Here's how they did it. We really should be pushing the same types of metrics everywhere.
When Jane isn't here, but she did have a question. It's Pride Month. About 10 years ago, WFTDA came up with a formal trans player policy that has since been refined and expanded. It was one of the first leagues to do this. This is Jane talking. I can remember playing against trans players. Montreal had a great player called Nameless Horror in a nod to the abuse that demographic has been subject to over the centuries. And I can say that from my team's part, we never felt at a disadvantage or that it was an issue to be inclusive.
Yeah, the WFTDA, I think, has struggled to be as equitable as we would like to be. And so, you know, we've actually talked a lot in recent days about the idea that we call ourselves real, strong, athletic, revolutionary. And it's the revolutionary part that I think we have to keep going back and pushing ourselves further and further. But we definitely, Jane actually wrote this really lovely story about us, I think in 2015 for ESPNW, around the clarifications and updates that we've made within the past few years to our gender statement and our gender policy. And we had at one point left the potential open for some type of medical presence in gender determination, and we've decided over the years that that's just discriminatory. So our gender policy, our gender statement, which you can find on our website at wftda.com, allows for the skater, community member, official to identify themselves, and that is not for us to ask about or question.
Caster Semenya is like the best 800-meter runner in, I think, the history of the world, maybe, and is not running.
Yeah.
How do we? What's your advice here?
I have a lot of challenges around the Olympic competitive pathways, particularly around the World Anti-Doping Agency, because I think that their techniques are and always have been invasive. I don't think that hormones define an athlete, and that is essentially the message that WADA, the CAS, the IOC often put forth. So those are things that we don't subscribe to, and that, you know, the community has asked quite a bit about the opportunities for roller derby in the Olympics, and our response is always not until they clean up their values. Like, we've got systems, USA Gymnastics within the United States, that has allowed abuses to go on for years and years. And so those are not systems that we're interested in being a part of.
So we're almost out of time, and this is Gerard Hector. Say hi, Gerard.
Hello, Erica.
Hi.
This is
How are you?
How we end the show. Yeah.
Good, thanks. How are you?
Lovely. This has been really fascinating. I'm actually now I'm like, I gotta watch more roller derby.
Roller derby. Google
Really?
roller derby.
I mean, I know what roller derby is, and I'm like, I gotta watch this thing now. A couple things for you. First, so the plan that you have set forth, that is available to the public. It's free. It's on your website.
It is. What we've done is we've asked people to register for it, so that you put your email address in case we have to update it, and we want to make sure that everybody who's downloaded it has the best, most recent information possible. So yes.
Okay. So I definitely want to. I want to dig into that, because Henry, there's some people we know who might want to. We might want them to see that. The other piece is, what economic and political, what were economic and political conversations like when you decided to put this plan together? Because, you know, we're all somewhat cynical on this show, and we know that the machine that is capitalism is not going to stop, right? And like, that's the major driving factor. And I feel like when Adam Silver and Michelle Roberts are having conversations, and they're good people, to be clear, they're very much like, how do we get our season to continue with the least amount of issues happening, versus, is it like, I don't know if they lead with, is it safe to have a season, right? Like, so what were the conversations like for you when you were putting this plan together, economically and politically?
Yeah, so roller derby is not immune to the loss of event-based revenue. So we went in and we did some calculations. I did some very rough calculations because I wanted to know the answer to that question too. And I think one of my calculations was, across all of our leagues and in our WFTDA events, we've probably lost about 3.65 million in revenue, which is not small change for us. Wow. So I think we are making decisions from a place, I guess the amateur system, I think, is the difference that you're asking about, because we do not necessarily, we're a member organization as well, so we do get revenue from membership dues. Those dues also do confer a democratic position within our conversations. And so I think our model is really what makes the difference here, because our memberships have a voice. They elect the board. The board oversees me. So I think creating a model that is totally different from the model that the NBA exists in, I think is the difference maker for us. We just make decisions differently.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think, you know, obviously it's the TV revenue is so big. I mean, that's such a large part of it for the NBA, and why they kind of have to move this thing forward, and the long-term effects of no lower salary cap and what that means for next season and all these things. And I think, yeah, you're in an advantageous place, but I still do think that, again, Henry, to your point, and to your point, Erica, it's about the data though, right? Like, if you have people who really use the data, you can say, this might not be a good idea, right? And like, we may have some unintended short-term consequences, like, right? Again, the lost revenue is a big deal. I don't want to make light of that. But in the end, it might actually be better. But, time will tell.
Yeah, and from a legal standpoint, real quick, I just wanted to say that I don't think that these leagues are plenty lawyered up, believe me. But I don't think that they really have any understanding of what the judgments could look like that come out of cases for liabilities moving forwards either. And that is a risk that they're clearly willing to take, which we're not.
Really fast from Bilal. He's asking how you look at doping in your league.
Oh yeah, sorry, I saw that. We typically don't. We typically don't. We actually, and I think it's having conversations that are open. Our community, like I said, is really good at holding each other accountable, and that's not part of our value system. So we don't necessarily have testing because we are essentially trusting athletes to do what they say they're going to do. We do have a code of conduct that allows for folks to be able to file grievances if that changes.
Okay. Erica, thank you so much. I imagine we could,
Great.
actually, can we check in with you like in a month or something?
Oh yeah, that would be fun.
That'd be
I
great.
like it.
Okay. And we didn't get a lot of donut stories, but I guess we can do that next time.
We could do that next month.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Be safe.